to. I might just try and, rather than use my laptop, just move up here. So, well, thanks again to the organizers for inviting me. So my disciplinary area is international relations. I do international security and actually do work related to the Korean Peninsula, related to nuclear issues, and have published in that area. But what I'm talking about today is a new research agenda. Well, I've been doing it a few years, but relatively new. And when I first started talking about this, you may be thinking, okay, how does this relate to Korea? But we'll get there, I promise you. So you just have to bear with me a little bit. So I'm talking about knowledge production of security in the Asia Pacific. So basically, what does security mean when we talk about the Asia Pacific? And in particular, looking at a new data set that we've created of 11 security studies journals over 7 years, and looking at what is Korea, or what is security when it comes to Korea. And we'll talk about how the research agenda started, the methods, findings about Korea and security studies knowledge production, and then conclusions and questions, because we actually have a lot more questions than conclusions right now. So this project essentially started with the International Security Studies section of the International Studies Association. So ISA is the big broad field for people who work in international relations, international studies. And this particular section has about 1,700 members from around the world. And so I was chair of the section starting in 2017. And, I had some concerns when I became chair, because I was previously on the governing council and knew that there were issues related, for example, to the way women felt about their participation in the section. And there were other, complaints. For example, we created a new journal, and we were told that, there were complaints that even though the journal editorial board was perfectly balanced gender-wise, it was 100% white. And, so there were a number of issues that were surfacing. I mean, one of them, for example, we have this Distinguished Scholar Award. It's been given out 19 times, but only once to a woman and once to a non-US born scholar. And it really is that the state of the field, that 18 out of 19 of the best security studies scholars we have are from the US. And so they're concerned. We had a lot of concerns. And so from that, I created this task force on diversity and security studies, basically to say, okay, what's going on here? Because I had some ideas about that there might be problems, but really I just wanted data collection, especially because I faced some people who were quite conservative and felt like everything was just great. And for me, the best way to be able to move ahead against opposition, or maybe even to sort of convert people who were opponents, is to gather data. And so that's what we did. So first, though, I want to say, what do we mean by diversity? And so we looked at gender, race. So we looked at demographic characteristics: gender, race, geographic location, sexual preference, and also intellectual characteristics, epistemology. So in international relations, there's a divide between sort of positivists, people who say, knowledge production can be objective, and post-positivists who say, no, anytime you're sort of producing knowledge, there's going to be elements of subjectivity to it. Theoretical approaches, methods, topics. So we'll get to the topics. And so there's actually quite a bit here, because a lot of times in our field, diversity means gender. And there's been in the literature related to diversity in higher education criticism that actually white women sort of soak up a lot of the diversity money and attention. And, as a white woman myself, I have to say, looking at what's been done, I think that is an absolutely fair criticism. And I didn't want that at all. So we did a lot of data collection, but data collection, I just want to say, can be difficult on some of these characteristics. So for example, the data set I'm talking to you about is about journal authorships. We look through these journals, record every title, every author, and then look up what is their gender. And so gender is something you can usually find out. There are actually sort of programs that where you can input your syllabus, your reading list, and it will calculate sort of the gender balance. And there is some error rate. There are some typical male names that people who identify as female use, and vice versa. But it's pretty good. You can also look people up. You can look up and typically find pronouns. But this is not possible to do with race, for example, because it would be based on appearance. And that's just not ethical. Another issue that has come up that I want to just say up front with geographical location, because there are concerns that the field of security studies is very dominated by American scholars. So we wanted to look at, well, where are authors based out of? We're also looking at, for example, syllabi of major universities. There's security studies syllabi. And again, it's very hard to find where someone was born. So when we talk about geographic location, we talk about their location at the time their article was published. So their institutional affiliation. So again, that doesn't quite get what we might want, but it's sort of the best we can do. So we did quantitative work, a survey of the membership, looked at security related journals, security studies syllabi. We've actually done lots of, this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg here. We've also done a number of interviews at US and international conferences. So the research team, it's been Connie Duncombe and myself. Connie was at Monash. She's moved to Copenhagen, unfortunately for us, fortunately for her, because it's a great position, but she's still sort of, I think, adjunct here at Monash. But we have numerous academics from around the world that have been doing this work. So it's not just me, this is a big team effort. So how does this relate to Korea? Well, one of the things that has come up quite a bit. Oh, we go backwards there. Here we go. There we go. So one of the most common criticisms we heard that's related to this point, if the case study is about the US or Europe, it counts as security. If it's about a country in Asia, Africa, or the Middle East, it's area studies. It's something else, but it's not security. And within international relations, to call something area studies is a not subtle criticism. So it's not a positive thing to say, oh, well, that's area studies, because the idea is area studies you don't generalize from, whereas security, well, that's generalizable. And of course, this is a real problem, because if you're saying, well, if it's about the US or Europe, it's generalizable, but if you're not talking about cases, well, they're not generalizable. Well, why? I mean, what's the intellectual justification for that? And so this is a criticism that came up about security studies journals and security, the field more broadly, through our interviews and the open text fields in the surveys. So this is paraphrased, it's not a direct quote from someone, but this came up quite a bit. So let's look at sort of broadly geography and the journals, so pulling from this data set. So you can see, first of all, there's several things here. The first is these are the journals we're talking about. And of course, there are other journals related to security issues. These are the sort of the top 11 we picked out. We have since just this year gotten funding to do another 4 journals, one of which is Asian security. So I think that will, including that may change some of our findings here, at least a little bit. But and of course, people publish on security related topics outside of security studies journals. So people may publish, in journals like international organizations or world politics or comparative politics about security issues. So we understand, this is there are limitations to this data set, but nonetheless, we just wanted to look and see what was going on here. So what countries dominate security studies journals? And so again, this is 7 years, every research article from these journals. So it's sort of, we've got the whole population, it's not just a sample. And you can see that there are 2 journals in particular where there's a sort of an extreme dominance of one country, where the percentage is 20% plus of the country's percentage of total authors, and then more than 50% of the total authors in the journal. And those are international security and security studies. And for those of you who aren't in the field, these are the 2 peak security studies journals. So especially international security, if you publish in that, essentially, I mean, I've heard people say it's a tenure breaker. Like if you get it, you'll get tenure for sure. And within the US job market, and I've heard down here, I have a colleague who said was actually applying for an academic job here in Australia. And they said, I've got to update my file because I just got to revise and resubmit from international security. And like that, it basically was like a prize they wanted to share. And so it's a real issue because if these are dominated by, I'm hearing feedback, is that just me? No problem. So, why is this? Is this because of merit? Is this, I mean, in my opinion, not at all. It's very interesting, some of the trends we've seen. For example, contemporary security policy, you can see on the left, which actually is not dominated, it's got actually one of the lowest numbers in terms of being dominated by a particular country. It's now got a higher impact factor than security studies. So, I think actually diversity is good for a journal, and I can talk more about that as well. So there are, 3,800 authors, 45% from the US. You can see South Korea down here, 1% or less. So they're in this sort of last category of, 1% or less of authors publishing in these journals over those 7 years are coming from South Korea. Now, this is looking at the Asia Pacific. So you can see these are the countries that where people had institutional affiliations in these countries, and these are the ones that appeared in the database. So again, this is, if a country is not listed here, it's because no one who had an institutional affiliation in that country published in those journals. And you can see over here the T, that's the total number of authors. So within the region, Australia has definitely got the highest number. So for South Korea, the #1 journal is the Journal of Conflict Resolution. That's where people are publishing in these security-related journals. And what's interesting is the Journal of Conflict Resolution is the main quantitative journal in this crowd. So 45% of the research by international security scholars in South Korea is going into is quantitative in nature. Next is contemporary security policy, which is sort of has a very broad remit. Their editorial policies are very open. And then the third is survival, which is a very sort of hard security journal that's very policy focused and is actually read by policymakers. So it's an interesting mix here for South Korea. Now, let's look at Korea specifically. So, 2 things related to our database. So basically, I did a search for Korea, and 2 types of entries came up. One is where someone's geographic location was Korea, and the second was when the article title had Korea in it, Korea or something related. So it could be Korean, for example. And so geographic location, less than 1% of all articles out of these 11 journals over 7 years were authored by scholars located in South Korea. Only 16 articles, 14 first authors and 2 second authors. And we compare that to, for example, 45% of all authors in the same data set were located in the United States. So this is just a very tiny percentage. And then I was surprised that it was so low, frankly. Korea as a topic, only one, this is actually more surprising to me because within international security, issues related to East Asia and Korea are very prominent. But only 1.3% of all articles had Korea in the title. Now, it would be better if we had the abstracts because, it may appear in the abstract, not the title, but we don't have the abstracts. And to be honest, we probably won't be adding them, at least not in this next round. Although I think it would be very useful. But nonetheless, I was trying to run the numbers and I'm having some issues with the data set. I can tell you that the US and the EU, the percentage that they show up is much, much higher. I would say the US and Europe probably aren't about 30% of the articles, if not higher. So again, the criticism that we heard that if it's the US or Europe, it counts as security. If it's not, it's not. We're actually seeing that play out in the actual database. So this isn't just these aren't just people who had maybe, frankly, these are the types of things I've heard from people who had rather than characterize their opinions, I'll just say, for example, I've heard, well, they're not doing good work. And so it's not just people who've been working on a topic related to Korea and that particular person didn't do good work, so they got rejected and it's kind of sour grapes. Well, actually, we can see in this very broad database over 7 years, 11 journals, that Korea is not included. Korea is very minor, whereas the US and Europe are, included quite a bit. And so that criticism that if it's the US or Europe, security, if it's not, it's not, we're actually seeing that play out. So it's not just sour grapes, it's actually what's happening in the journals. So only 36 articles out of over 2,700. So I just wanted to quickly show you which journals are publishing related to Korea. And so these are those with Korea in the title. And survival is the top. Again, survival is a sort of very policy-focused journal. Contemporary security policy, journal strategic studies. Those top three are all very policy-focused. International security is also quite policy-focused. It's interesting, the next two, Critical Studies on Security and European Journal of International Security, are sort of not, they publish a lot of non-positivist work, so much more critical theory related. And in fact, Danielle Chubb, one of the authors who isn't here today, I'm not sure if she's on Zoom or not, but she's one of the authors in our database, published, I believe, in Critical Studies on Security. And then the last two that I wanted to mention, Cooperation and Conflict, that's published, I think, out of Norway, and it is very European focused. And then Security Dialogue is it's a heavily critical theory journal. So again, I'm not sure, like I said, in a lot of cases, we have more questions than answers about what this means, but I do think there are important questions raised by the data. And then finally, what are the topics within these articles? And so this is a word cloud. I just actually took all of the articles and popped it into a word cloud, and this is what came up. So you can see nuclear is by far the biggest, and then you can see security, strategic, weapons, and the article focus, over 50% were related to North Korea, and then Korea Peninsula, and South Korea was third. The three top article topics, the first was nuclear, the second was related to US somehow in there, and the third was China, somehow related to China. And I would say that the three of these took up about 50% of the articles. So in other words, when people are publishing in these top security studies journals about Korea, they're publishing about nuclear or somehow relationships with the US or China. So it's, not entirely. There's research done that relates, for example, something about South Korean conscription policy. I remember one. Another is about visualization and the demilitarized zone. And, so it's not all like that, but by far the large, the biggest chunk of topics relate to these sort of hard security concerns about North Korea, the US, and China. And so it's, again, I was not surprised, but, for me, my question is, but there's a lot more related to security than just these topics. And one of the things we're doing is we're looking at analysis of US focused articles. And I can tell you that, it's not going to be 50% related to nuclear in China. Like, there will be a much more variegated landscape in terms of international security topics. And so I feel like that, I'll move to the last slide here. Sort of conclusions and questions. This second to last. So security studies journals are dominated by authors located in the United States and to a lesser extent Europe. Korea as a topic represents only a minuscule number of articles in top security studies journals. So we can conclude those. So questions. To what extent are these findings a result of gatekeeping? And, again, we have to realize that authors may be publishing elsewhere. You can certainly do work on international security and not publish in these journals. But given what we heard in our interviews and in the survey, open text boxes, people did feel that there was gatekeeping going on, and that has been borne out by our data. So the question is, who's permitted to participate in knowledge production about international security? And why is Korea not a valid case for generalization in security studies? As I mentioned, topics about the US and Europe were much more variegated, whereas with North Korea or with anything related to Korea, if it wasn't about nuclear, the US or China, it's just a much smaller percentage of articles. Why? What is security studies losing out on because Korea is not used as a case for theory building and testing? And then my last question, because really there are implications for policy when it comes to knowledge production. So academic knowledge production affects policy. We know that, and there's research on it. So what is Korea losing out on because Korea is not used as a case for theory building and testing? And the fact that academic research published in these English language journals all seem to focus on Korea just because of nuclear, just because of the issues related to the US and China, when there's actually a lot more research that's unrelated to those areas, but still related to security issues, and what is being lost out in terms of academics and the policy community. Because as academics, we know if something won't get published somewhere, it's not something we're excited to research. So in any case, these are, as I said, questions and conclusions, and also a lot more questions than we have conclusions. And I look forward to your thoughts. Thanks very much.
Well, Maria, sorry, why don't I just stay here? I wonder, I don't know, hopefully this will come out all right on Zoom. Can you hear okay on Zoom? Why don't we just stay where we are, actually, if that's all right? 3 speakers. Actually, probably not. Sorry, we'll do musical chairs. Come down here, David. Maybe we can go to questions. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. So, and we've got 2 microphones, so we're well equipped. Are there any questions for 3 panelists? So Nazmi.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to the 3 panelists. Those were all really interesting conversations. I think this is one of the few times in my life that in an hour I've talked about soju and then the critical post-positive security studies, but I think maybe I should have more of this in my life.